We're going to pick it up where we left off, classes in Chinese society. We're actually going to look now at Neo-Confucianism and how that kind of established a lot of this kind of class-based society in China. So Neo-Confucianism was a thought promoted by Zhu Shi, and he kind of combined Confucian morality, so the needs to have a upstanding moral society to keep society functioning that relied on relationships, but also combined it with kind of the logic of Buddhism. So it was kind of a syncretic religion, but wasn't really a religion in itself. It didn't really take all the meditations and the belief in the reincarnation. It didn't really take all that from Buddhism, but it took more of the logic from it. Education at various levels was promoted by the Ming and the Qing. The Hanlin Academy was established in Beijing to promote Neo-Confucianism, as well as provincial schools. So kind of like states as we have in the United States, you'd see these various schools that promoted Neo-Confucianism. The reason why they did this is because Neo-Confucianism is what kind of held together Chinese society. It brought stability to the Ming and the Qing. It brought kind of a consistent governmental bureaucrat system to the dynasty. That's why they supported these endeavors. So let me go back 1 second. But there was also popular novels. So pop culture became kind of a thing in Qing dynasty. As they had woodblock printing, and they had printing available to them. They could print these books in large numbers, and you have popular novels such as Journey to the West, which is probably the most well-known of the Chinese novels from this period in history, which would actually be what Dragon Ball Z is based off of. So it's based off of a very old book from this period in history. So Christianity had been in China for a long time. Nestorian Christians and Roman Catholic Christians have been in China, but disappeared mostly after the Yuan dynasty kind of went to disrepair after the bubonic plague went through that region. But they would return, and the Jesuits would return under Matteo Ricci, and he would attempt to convert the emperor himself, Juan Li. He was a Jesuit, he was an Italian, and he had actually mastered Chinese before a first visit in 1601. So the guy, before he even went and stepped foot in China, was learning to speak the language. He was a master of the Chinese language. In fact, he could speak with people in the courts fluently. He could write in Chinese, read Chinese. Quite impressive. He did all this before Google. Pretty nice. And Rosetta Stone. But he brought Western mechanical technology as well as other missionaries. So harpsichords, clocks, which the Chinese were fascinated by the use of clocks, prisms, all these things, scientific technology were some things that were fascinating the Chinese. So the diffusion of technology into China was largely the result of missionaries, which is very interesting. And additionally, he also helped fashion bronze cannons, correct maps with China at the center, of course, and he also helped correct the Chinese calendar, which was a little bit off. So he brought all this knowledge from Europe with him to kind of help the Chinese. Interesting. He also argued that Christianity was consistent with Confucianism, that it was something that the two could coexist. He felt like early Confucianism and a lot of the teachings of Confucius mirrored those of Jesus Christ, and in some ways he is correct. There are some things that are similar between the two doctrines. If you just go and do a little research, you see the silver rule of China, the golden rule of Confucius, and the golden rule of Jesus Christ, that treat your neighbor as you would treat yourself, love thy neighbor. Same thing was promoted by Confucius, he said it a little bit differently, but they're very, very similar. But there's other things that are similar as well. But what he got there was very few people who were willing to convert to Christianity. In fact, only 200,000 people, about less than 1% of the population, was willing to convert to Christianity. And the reason for this is because Christianity is fairly absolutist. If you want to convert to Christianity, you got to abandon your past religious affiliations or your past cultural traditions. You have to accept the teachings of Christ wholeheartedly. You can't just come to Christianity and then continue to be a Taoist and Buddhist on the side. This is not accepted. A lot of Chinese don't really like to deal with absolutes. So they didn't want to abandon their past because that's important to their culture and their tradition. So the way that Matteo Ricci got around this was, okay, you guys can keep your Confucian practices, you can continue to worship your ancestors, that's fine, but you're going to convert to Christianity. And he gained a sizable number of followers by doing that. But essentially, he got tattled on by Franciscans and Dominicans who convinced the Pope that Jesuits, like Ricci, were compromising Christianity with Chinese traditions. So allowing them to worship their ancestors was a big no-no. You don't worship your ancestors in Catholicism. Don't do that. So the Pope said, all right, that's fine. We're going to put a stop to this. Jesuits, what are you doing over there? Stop letting them continue to worship ancestors. That's not being a good Christian or Catholic this time. So the the Pope said, enough of that, Jesuits. So they had to kind of abandon their efforts at converting the population because the Chinese would still want to continue to worship their ancestors. In fact, when Emperor Kangxi, the Qing emperor, got a word of this, he banned Christianity in China. It wasn't entirely effective, but enough to kind of make Christianity fade out of China. And it never really gained a very large foothold in China because Chinese people are very traditional. And Christianity is very absolute and would force them to abandon those traditions. That's why Christianity never really took off, but it did bring a lot of positives. The Jesuits, at least, brought a lot of positives to China through technology. So now we're moving to Japan. And Japan has a lot of its kind of roots in a lot of Chinese Confucius culture, but we're going to talk firstly about the unification of Japan. So shoguns, who were essentially military rulers of China, military governors of Japan, ruled from the 12th to 16th centuries. They were the large landholders with private armies, very similar to European feudalism under right after the fall of Rome. So you had these large landowners that were largely self-sufficient with their own private armies. So the emperor or king, like we'd see in Europe, is merely a figurehead. He doesn't have much power. And because of all these different landholders with different armies, they're getting a little bit power hungry. So there's constant civil war. In the 16th century, they consider it Sengoku, or a country at war. Constant. The whole entire 16th century was pretty much warfare. Tokugawa Ieyasu would establish a military government. It's what he called a tent government because he said, oh, it's only going to be temporary. Well, it didn't turn out to be very temporary because the Tokugawa dynasty or shogunate would last from 1600 to 1867, so right after the Civil War in the United States of America. So quite a long time. It wasn't temporary. So again, Tokugawa Japan if you look at Japan, it has extremely close proximity to China. So a lot of Chinese cultural traditions would make their way through Korea to Japan, and just directly from China as well. So the shogun sought to control the daimyo, who were the great names, the most important lords throughout the empire. And there were 260 territorial lands throughout Japan. There were independent militaries, independent justices, schools, foreign relations. They all had their own independence. Just think about 260 states in the islands of Japan. It's going to lead to a lot of turmoil. So the shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate, from their capital in Edo, which was called then, it's now called Tokyo, the shogun required what was called alternate attendance, which was essentially he forced people, or daimyo, who are these lords in these 260 districts, to spend every other year of their lives at court in Edo. And the reason they did this is to keep a close eye on the territorial lords and keep them from getting too much power. They also saw that, hey, maybe if we bring them here, they're going to spend a ton of money on lavish, places to live and just, chilling in Edo, and not spending much money on their military. And that was largely successful. They controlled marriage and socializing of daimyo families. So, they didn't really allow them to talk with one another because they wanted to make sure and prevent any destabilization of the Tokugawa shogunate. So beginning in the 1630s, shoguns restrict foreign relations. And the reason they did this for over 200 years is because they wanted to prevent daimyo and certain lords from getting too much power or technology from Europeans, especially guns. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now you would see, because of this period of a lack of conflict between the lords and the Tokugawa shogunate would bring prosperity. A lot of this had to do with improved crops, irrigation systems, agricultural production becoming better, but there were also population growth became a little bit moderate. And that was in order to bring about economic stability. They practiced contraception. They married late. They even committed abortions in large numbers. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they wanted to continue to live lives that were economically stable. And they called it thinning out the rice shoots. It's not a particularly good little phrase, but it was their attempt to make sure that they had stability economically. So you saw population growth between 1600 and 1700 for the arrival of new foods, but after 1700, it doesn't grow very much. So, end of civil disturbances create massive unemployment of daimyo and social and samurai warriors. So if there's no fighting, the warriors, the bushido, the people living by bushido, the way of the warrior, and samurais, they're not needed anymore. So they're encouraged to join scholarship. But many more declined into poverty and just couldn't do anything. When there's no war, there's no purpose for the soldiers of fortune. So it was pretty problematic for them. Urban wealthy classes developed from trade activity, though. So with this prosperity, there was trade going on within Japan. So the Japanese benefited from this. Merchant class, yes. So Neo-Confucianism was prevalent in Japan as well. So the Chinese cultural traditions, which moved over from China, extended through the Tokugawa period. They studied Chinese language. If you look at, a lot of people confused when they look at Japanese, they think it's Chinese, but there's some similarities between the two. The Chinese use a Chinese script, but now they have their own. But during this period, they used Chinese language as their curriculum and their written language. Jushu and the Neo-Confucian remained popular because it brought stability to Japanese culture, but there was also a promotion of native learning, that we need to be Japanese. We need to find our Japanese identity. We don't need to be Chinese. They followed folk traditions and especially followed the practice of ancestor veneration in Japan, known as Shinto, which is a local religion. So Neo-Confucianism even made its way to Japan as well. So you had these what were known as floating worlds, where people would kind of embark in entertainment and pleasure. They go to the bathhouses, they go to brothels, they go to restaurants, theaters, puppet theaters as well. Basically, there were these places, ukiyo, where you could just kind of have fun, so to speak. Kind of like the Vegas of Japan, all over the place. Christianity also made its way into Japan. It was largely successful among certain daimyos who hoped to establish trade relations. So converting to Christianity also had economic benefits. So they wanted to get technology for the Europeans. They wanted to get it through joining Christianity. Government feared this. They feared it as foreign intrusion. That they resented Christian absolutism, just like they did in China. So you saw anti-Christian campaigns for a period of about 60 years where Christians would be executed many times by crucifixion or burning at the stake, because they saw them as, they were going to destabilize Japan by bringing foreign religion, foreign tradition, and then especially the potential for military technology or trade relations being established with foreigners. But then you would see it's kind of easing on that, and that there would be a Dutch presence on the southern province of Nagasaki, which was a route for Japanese understanding of the world. So the Dutch were allowed to trade, and from this trading, they would get an understanding of the outside world and begin to learn about science, medicine, and art. That's going to conclude our lecture for China and Japan. I hope you enjoyed it, and you guys have a great day.